This is account 3302 at SIUE, and we are starting Lessor accounting. So if you're watching this video, you should have the hard copy of the Lessor lecture note with you. This is the front page of the lecture note, and this is just a roadmap of Lessor accounting. At this point, we've had lessee accounting. A lot of it's going to be similar. We're going to use the same toolkit, but there are some twists and turns. So a lessor can have an operating lease or a capital lease, but what we're going to see is there's two types of capital leases. One is a direct financing lease, and the other type is a sales type lease. This may sound like it's going to be really, really complicated, but we're going to learn direct financing first, and we're going to see that sales type is just a direct financing, plus at lease inception, we're just going to have a sale tacked on. So what does that mean? That means once we do the journal entry at inception, everything about the sales type lease will be identical, absolutely identical to a direct financing. Okay. Now, similar to lessee accounting, we're going to go through a step of classifying the lease first. And classifying a lease is always vital because it dictates which accounting you're going to use. With both direct financing and sales type, we're going to capitalize a lease receivable. And we're going to remove equipment, which seems a little bit unnatural because the lessor will still own it, but they're going to remove the value of it and just have this lease receivable. With the sales type, we're going to remove inventory. We're going to call it inventory instead of equipment. And because it's a sale, we'll also record sales and cost of goods sold. But what are we capitalizing for the lessor? In both cases, we're going to capitalize a lease receivable. All right. And lessor accounting, now that you've done lessee, is actually a little easier because all we're going to have is this interest revenue. And because we remove the equipment under a capital lease for the lessor, there's no depreciation left. Okay. So all you're going to accrue, if it is a capital lease, is the interest revenue. Under an operating lease, you don't do anything at lease inception. You're going to recognize rent revenue. You depreciate the item as normal because that's not particular to lease accounting, we're not going to cover the depreciation if it's an operating lease. And at lease maturity, there's nothing to do. Okay? Along the way over here, as I mentioned, we're going to have interest revenue. You will not have sales revenue and cost of goods sold along the way because they are completely recognized, fully recognized at lease inception. When you, under either type of capital lease, at the end of the lease, when you bring the item back onto the balance sheet, you may recognize a gain or loss at that time. All right, that's kind of a minor point for our purposes. Okay, so lessor accounting classification. We don't have to spend a lot of time here because these what are called now Group 1 criteria. This is a non-cancelable lease agreement that we're starting with, and they should look very familiar because they're identical to the lessee. If it meets any one of these, then we go to Group 2. That's the difference with lessor. We're going to see there's a second hurdle. So we're going to do the Group 1 criteria, same as lessee. If it's non-cancelable and it meets any one of these four, then we go to Group 2. And if it meets both of these so-called Group 2 criteria, then we know it's a capital lease, but we have to separate it out to direct financing and sales type. So if there's a gross profit, then it's a sales type. So essentially, if the lessor's cost of the asset is less than fair value, then it's a sales type. If not, it's a direct financing type. Okay? But once you've met Group 1 and Group 2 criteria up here, you know that you have a capital lease. The last step is just, do I have a direct financing capital lease or a sales type capital lease? Okay? So that's the classification. Conceptually, why do we have Group 1 and Group 2? Well, the lessor is recognizing a lease receivable. If you recognize a lease receivable, you have to be able to collect the payments or expect to collect the payments. That's the first one here. And if you're going to demand the payments, you should be able to provide the leased items. So if there's a lot of important uncertainties around their unreimbursable costs, then you're not going to recognize the receivable. So, for example, if you're leasing a nuclear power plant, which may seem ridiculous at this point in your business career, but these types of transactions do happen. If you're going to lease a nuclear power plant, but the waste has to be dealt with, and if you're the lessor and you said, I'll take care of that, but there's so much regulatory questions around it and so forth, you may determine that there's too many uncertainties around your unreimbursable costs, and it doesn't meet the Group 2 criteria, so you can't collect or recognize the lease receivable, because if there's some law that you think may be changing, that's going to put a lot of cost on you as a lessor. Okay, so that's why the lessor has these Group 2 criteria, just to make sure that the receivable is in fact receivable. Okay, and once again, with operating lease, how do we know it's an operating lease? Because we didn't classify it as a capital lease. Okay, under both direct financing, so this is a lot of words, but regardless if it's a sales type or direct financing type, I mentioned before, there's always a lease receivable. Always, always, always. All right? Now, what's a little bit different than our lessee is the amount of the lease receivable is the present value of minimum lease payments, which is the same as before, but it's plus the present value of any unguaranteed residual value. And we're also going to use the implicit rate. So the lease receivable, I'm going to say LR equals the present value of the minimum lease payments, and we have no question about the interest rate, plus the present value of any unguaranteed UNG RV residual value. So that's kind of a little bit confusing, but what does it mean? It means unless there's some kind of transfer of ownership, the lessor will always include the residual value. The lessor will always include the residual value. So, if it's an unguaranteed residual value, the present value of it will be in this term. If the residual value is guaranteed, it's over here in the present value of minimum lease payments. Remember that, whoops, that's kind of funky. What is that all about? Remember that the minimum lease payments includes guaranteed residual value. So the lease receivable, I need a different colored pen. Let's get a little exciting here. So LR always includes the present value of the residual value, guaranteed or not. Now, you have to think this is the lessor's residual value. If there is a residual value, but the item is going to transfer ownership, the lessor's residual interest in the property is zero. Okay, so when there's a transfer, all bets are off because the lessor's residual value is zero, right? They're not getting any of it. But whenever there is a residual value to be had by the lessor, it will always be in the value of the amount capitalized. Okay. Let's see. Finally, the difference between the two types of inception. All right. The sales type lease will recognize sales revenue and cost of goods sold, and still has the lease receivable. Okay. Sales revenue equals the present value of minimum lease payments. So sales revenue equals the present value of the minimum lease payments, and cost of goods sold will equal the cost of the item leased less the present value of any unguaranteed residual value. So that is quite a mouthful. You're really going to need to see that in action. But let me just say, if you have a sales type lease, really the only tricky part is determining sales revenue and cost of goods sold. Okay? And when we get to the example, we'll go over that. We're going to recognize interest revenue under the effective interest method, which is beginning of period carrying value. So we have carrying value beginning of the period times the effective rate will equal interest revenue. The residual value is, whenever there is one for the lessor, will always be in there. Okay, the present value is always capitalized. In most cases, what's going to happen, we're going to see, in most cases, this is really important, the amount of the lease receivable will thus be equal to fair value. In fact, if you're given the fair value of the asset that's being leased and you don't really have any other information, it's always reasonable to assume that the lease receivable will equal the fair value of the item leased. There is no depreciation expense that's relevant to a capital lease or related to a capital lease. If it is an operating lease, the lessor will continue to depreciate the item as normal. Okay? But we're not going to do that depreciation. All right, so these are the Cougar construction examples from the lessee lecture note. And they're going to have the same setup, but now we're going to do the lessor side. Okay, this is Cougar construction and a 5-year lease. And I'm going to break the video right here so you can join it back at the second part. And we'll start the examples in the second part.